My name is Vic Elford, and I'm getting quite old now, but you don't really need to know that. My career started very, very late, in fact, because right after the Second World War, I was already 10 years old, and in those days there was no such thing as going motor racing. The only people who drove racing cars were wealthy young gentlemen who could afford to go out and buy them. There was no sort of background or way into racing as there is today. Today, for example, the kids of the day are driving go-karts before they can walk in some cases, whereas back then there were no such things as go-karts. I first of all became a co-driver to a friend of mine whose mother had a little, not quite one, the equivalent of the lottery, but along those lines. So he finished up with an MG sports car, and we started doing little British rallies together. It was his car, so he was the driver and I was the co-driver, navigator. And I progressed slowly along that line, still being always the co-driver, navigator, until eventually I was able to swap sides in the car and become a driver in my own right. But I first drove in a really serious competition. By the time I drove for the first time in a serious competition, I was already 26 years old, which of course by today's standards is ludicrous, because in today's world, drivers have become champions and retired as multimillionaires by the time they're 26. And I was still doing nothing, staggering around, scraping up money to go racing. And I had my first real chance, I suppose is the word, when DKW brought they sent two cars to the United Kingdom, to England, one to be driven in driving tests to Gymkhana type events by a driver they already knew, and the other one to be driven in rallies. And they said to the other guy, well, give that car to Vic Elford. And so he did, and I still had to pay all my expenses with it, but at least I had a car, and the DKW with a little three-cylinder two-stroke engine at that time, apart from being very noisy, it was also quite powerful and very fast. And so I set about winning rallies. I won two major national rallies back-to-back 2 weekends running, and that lined me up for my first drive, a factory drive in a factory team, which was the Triumph team. And I slowly went on from there into Triumph and then Ford and eventually Porsche. And by the time I got to Porsche, I was ready to start racing, and which had always been my goal. Rallying was strictly, at least at that point, rallying was strictly a means to an end, if you like. But I started then both rallying with Porsche and racing with Porsche, and slowly moved more into racing than rallying. Doing long distance events was my speciality. I was probably better at long distance than sprint events. And the first time that Porsche won the 24 hours of Daytona, I was driving, and that was 50 years ago, our 50th anniversary this year. I won the Monte Carlo Rally just 2 weeks before Daytona, also a 50th anniversary. And believe it or not, that was actually the first time that Porsche had won the Monte Carlo Rally, and the last time, incredibly, that a British driver had won it. No British driver has won it since, which is unbelievable, really. And then I went on through that year. Everything went well. I won I won the European Championship in 1967 in rallies with Porsche. I won the British Touring Car Championship, saloon car racing, if you like, with Porsche with a 911, which was classified because of its two little back seats as a four-seater touring car, saloon car. And then in 1968, well, Monte Carlo Rally, Daytona 24 hours, and then I had an outstanding race in Sicily in the Targa Florio. It's a 10-lap race over basically a 45-mile mountain, not a circuit, 45 miles of tiny mountain roads, 10 laps of that. And I started the first lap 18 minutes behind the leading car because I'd had wheel and tyre troubles on the first lap, and I managed to get it all back and win. So that was, for me, a special, very special event. And it just sort of carried on snowballing until I got to around the mid-70s. And then one day I just said, had enough. You know, I'm just really not very interested anymore. Partly because sponsorship was just beginning to raise its pretty or ugly head, depending on how it was. And I can do lots of things, but selling is not one of them. And so when it came to going out and selling sponsorships, other people would do that sort of thing a lot better than I can. And I was never able to attract the correct sort of sponsorship. And none of the factories were in it to the point where you could make a total living, as they are now, of course. So really that was the beginning and end of my life as a race driver.